Yeah, exactly. Please be seated. Maybe should have done that.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 9, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2023, adjourned debate. Honourable Ms. Hoffman.
Honourable members, before the Assembly is second reading of Bill 9, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2023. Is there anyone wishing to join in the debate? To the Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise this evening to speak to Bill 9, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2023. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this bill is less about red tape reduction and more about fixing the UCP errors. This is another piece of legislation that shows this government pushing ill-informed ideas and doesn't have the data to back that up. When we're looking at this legislation, and I think I've said this to every piece of legislation that the Red Tape Reduction Ministry has entered, it just seems a little bit ridiculous that we have a minister assigned to something that every ministry should be responsible for doing. This is a piece of legislation that impacts agriculture and forestry, municipal affairs, multiculturalism, labour and immigration, Service Alberta, seniors and housing, community and social services, red tape reduction, infrastructure, culture, and justice. Now, I've been through the legislation, and it's quite significant. Now, there are areas of this legislation that do not have concerns. But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the WCB portion of this legislation, we've watched in this House over and over as our incredible critic has brought up retroactive pay for firefighters. Now, this piece of legislation could have been an opportunity for this government to honour the heroes that so valiantly fought in the Fort McMurray wildfires. They could have gone back and introduced retroactive coverage, but they didn't. I can say on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, that we will always, on this side of the House, have the backs of our frontline heroes. We are very concerned that the minister responsible has got up in the House and talked rhetoric and talked about not anything related to retroactive pay. But what he hasn't committed to is providing that presumptive coverage that is retroactive, which is really concerning. I was a member in the Legislature during the Fort McMurray fires. I had friends that fought in the fire, that had businesses there, that were working alongside so many frontline, desperate to keep homes, desperate to keep property. And then hearing the incredibly devastating stories of so many that fled the wildfires. And then to not honor and support those that stayed and fought the fires is unimaginable, Mr. Speaker. And so when we've continued to bring forward that this should be covered and it's not being acknowledged, and it's certainly not in this legislation, it is concerning. Now, it has one minister responsible, the Minister for Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction. I'm just curious how much consultation happened with the other ministries that I named, and with all of those that are impacted, because when you're dealing with that many ministries, Mr. Speaker, putting forward a piece of legislation, that's a lot of consulting that needs to happen. And I would love to hear from the member who's been chirping about what kind of consultation he had. And was it him who decided to say no to the Fort McMurray firefighters? Was it the minister responsible that said no? I'm just curious, when it comes to consulting, who said no? And why, when we've asked repeatedly for this coverage to be retroactive, this government hasn't done it. And so I really hope that when it comes to hear from the members of government, we can hear some of the reasons why they've said no to the Fort McMurray wildfire heroes. So when it comes to this piece of legislation, there's another piece in here that's a bit concerning, and it's regarding income and employment supports. Now, what they're introducing, Mr. Speaker, is the ability to deny someone income support that has warrants. That gives an incredible disadvantage to people that may not know they have warrants, may have warrants so old that they thought it had been resolved, and now they're in a place where they can't access income support. That is very, very concerning. I can speak to a few people that I'm aware of who have struggled with mental health and addiction, who have received warrants for different instances. And I can tell you, with 3 of the cases that I'm thinking of, they're related to someone who has failed to appear in court. They're not for horrific crimes. When people are served and they fail to appear, a warrant is issued. Now, when you're struggling, you don't have a home, when you're struggling with addictions because you can't access the adequate supports and services, I can tell you, getting to court is really difficult. So having these individuals come forward, connect with a support worker who can get them their ID, help them get onto income support, and then have them denied because they have an outstanding warrant. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, a lot of those warrants are issued when someone fails to appear in court. They haven't been convicted. So to put this barrier to those on income and employment supports is a major, major concern. This government will tell you that the reason is because it's regarding dangerous offenders. But that's not what this legislation does. It doesn't discriminate. It says warrants, period. There are so many individuals who have come in contact with the justice system, who have faced barrier after barrier after barrier, and now we're at a place to find support. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, sometimes it can take years for an individual to be able to have the capacity to reach out and connect with someone who can get them to the steps of income support. And once they're at that phase, you have this person who's able now in a position to apply for income support and then to have them denied because of an outstanding warrant is ludicrous. It's going to be another barrier that for some is going to absolutely prevent them from progress and stability. Now, the other thing that is concerning with this is that it will allow the minister to divulge information to assist in locating the individual. So this gives the minister the authority to release private information with someone who has a warrant. Now again, there's no definition of what that warrant needs to be for. It could be someone who failed to appear in court. That is very, very concerning, and it significant overreach when it comes to people who have warrants looming. We should be providing supports and opportunities for individuals to access supports, not creating a space where this government is creating more and more barriers and closing doors to those that need actual support and are entitled to support. But there's a pattern that we see with this government. They talk about wanting to help, and they talk about wanting to go through and reduce red tape, but at what cost? I fail to see how this is a red tape reduction. Now the minister is chirping again, and I would welcome him when it's his time to speak, to stand and share your views in this chamber. But, it's concerning when so many individuals are reaching out, asking for ways that they can access supports for their loved ones, trying to find a landlord that will rent to them because they've been unhoused for years and have no formal reference. Now, what would that look like, Mr. Speaker, if not only do they not have a formal reference, but they don't have income support? This is another barrier that's creating more and more trauma to individuals instead of reducing red tape, as this bill suggests. Now, there's an incredible amount of individuals in the province that are in a place where they need income support. And as a social worker, I've worked with so many who are doing it because they need support. People that are accessing income support, it helps Albertans accessing food, shelter, personal items, medical, other benefits that are absolutely essential to their health and well-being. And this minister has put in that someone with a warrant, regardless of what that warrant is for, can be denied. That to me just doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker. I know that I would love to hear from the minister responsible for Service Alberta and red tape reduction to not talk about the key messaging that he's been told he should say and all about the things that red tape is going to do, but talk about the human side and the human impact that these decisions and this legislation is making. How does he answer to those Fort McMurray firefighters? I would love to hear that, Mr. Speaker. Talk to Albertans who are paying attention, watching what this government has done, has turned their back on Albertans over and over, and then puts forward a piece of legislation that they all get up and praise each other over. That's just two of the ministries in this omnibus legislation that has a direct impact on Albertans. People that are vulnerable and struggling and are Fort McMurray wildfire heroes. I would encourage, instead of chirping on the sidelines, to have him stand up in this chamber and speak to the legislation and speak to the questions that this side of the House are asking on behalf of Albertans. It's something that I think that they need to answer to. It's simply bad policy, Mr. Speaker, and it's not going to have an impact or deter people from committing crimes, if that's what they're going to stand up and talk about. It's not going to reduce crime. It's not going to do any of those things. It's simply going to create another barrier for an individual struggling to get ahead, to get those vital supports that I talked about, like housing and food. This winter, I had a very dear friend whose brother and his significant other have been unhoused for about 2.5 years. They both struggle with addictions, both from a car accident where they were prescribed medication, and both were living rough. They would try and access supports, try and access shelters, but there were so many barriers. Then they tried to access safe consumption sites. And again, significant barriers. When it came time for them to find housing, they really struggled. And I can tell you that this piece of legislation does absolutely nothing to help those individuals. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, before the Assembly, Bill 9. The Honourable, the Minister of Technology and Innovation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was listening intently as the member opposite was sharing her thoughts on this legislation, especially as it relates to the part of the legislation that deals with income supports for those folks who have been accused of a prescribed offense. That is some language that she neglected to refer to. And she was so materially inaccurate in her assertion about what this bill will do that I just felt compelled to stand up and correct the record. Mr. Speaker, for those watching at home, what is this about? This is, at the end of the day, this is about dangerous offenders. Mr. Speaker, our government cares deeply about protecting our communities, protecting Albertans, and ensuring that our communities are safe. Mr. Speaker, I think that is in keeping with what all Albertans want to see from their government. And Mr. Speaker, this legislation, as the member well knows, there is a time and a place to put something in legislation and a time and a place to put something in regulation. And this legislation very clearly states that this restriction on access to income supports will only apply to those folks who are accused of a prescribed offense. And we have made it very clear that our intention is in regulation to clarify that that is going to be for dangerous offenders. The members opposite are trying to make it sound like every person who has ever had a minor brush up with the law are all of a sudden going to lose access to income support. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is designed to protect Albertans from the most dangerous offenders. Mr. Speaker, we have a track record of making great progress in that regard. Mr. Speaker, many in this House will remember when we brought forward legislation to ensure that dangerous offenders and sex offenders could never change their names in Alberta and hide from their past and hide in our communities. Those were two very concrete steps that we took to make our communities safer. Well, I am proud of the work that the Minister of Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction is taking to go even one step further, which is to make sure that those dangerous offenders in Alberta who are hiding from law enforcement cannot rely on income support to make it easier to hide in our communities and to avoid justice. Mr. Speaker, I believe firmly that Albertans want justice and they want safe communities. And this change in legislation, followed by the accompanying regulatory work that will follow it, will in fact make our communities safer. Mr. Speaker, I can say that in good conscience, and I know that the constituents in my community will sleep better at night knowing that this is in place. Mr. Speaker, what the members opposite are doing is classic fear-mongering. They apparently can think of nothing better to do than to scare Albertans with things that are not even accurate. And they don't care about the harm that those allegations they make might cause. They don't care about the fact that people will be afraid by the things that they are saying, even though those things are not accurate, Mr. Speaker. And that is why I felt so compelled to stand up and to correct the record and to explain what exactly it is that this legislation will do and why our government feels so compelled to act on this legislation. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, this is about protecting Albertans, keeping our communities safe, protecting Alberta families. The members opposite should be ashamed of themselves for the way in which they have mischaracterized what this will do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there others? The honourable member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am very happy to get up and address this bill, particularly after the statement we've just heard from the minister across, because what we just heard from the minister is wholly inaccurate, and we'll take the time to talk about why it is we're really concerned about this. With these omnibus bills, there's always a problem. There's so many different things that are being put forward here that inevitably, of course, I support a variety of them. They're just minor changes, or they're decent changes that come from experience, and I support that kind of thing. But somehow the Conservatives always manage to find a way to slip in a poison pill, which just makes it impossible for me to support the bill overall. And this is it for me. This piece of the Immigrant and Employment Supports Act is one that I just really cannot support. And I want to take people to a place that they can understand a little bit about why it is that we are concerned, in spite of what the minister said. And I'll go on to talk about why the minister is essentially wrong about what they have indicated. And that is, what is happening in this particular bill, in this particular section, is essentially the criminalization of poverty. And many people in this House will know about the book written by Victor Hugo in 1862 called Les Miserables, and many people will know it, of course, through the Broadway play Les Mis, in which a man who is trying to feed his sister's 6 starving children steals a loaf of bread and is sentenced to jail for 5 years, ultimately spends 20 years, and is pursued even after by the police. And the whole point of this writing of this novel by Victor Hugo over 160 years ago was to say that we cannot criminalize poverty, that it is an injustice, and that we must, whenever somebody commits an offense, we must endeavor to right the wrongs, to invite that person back into civil society, and give them the wherewithal and the abilities to integrate back into the society we want with the skills and the resources necessary to become a successful member of society. 160 years ago, it was identified that this was an injustice to punish people continually for an offense. And that's essentially what this section of the bill does. Now, I know the minister gets up and says, oh, this isn't going to be used on everybody. No, nothing is used on everybody. And he says, don't worry about it. It'll come out when we do the regulations, and that's when we'll talk about what those prescribed offenses are. Our point is that he had the choice. He could have put in this bill what the prescribed offenses are that this will be used against. And he chose not to do that. It would have been no problem at all to say those people convicted of violent offenses. It would be no problem at all to say it is people that have used a weapon in their offenses, or any of other number of descriptors. They were all possible. It's quite easy to define terms in a bill like this. They chose not to do that because it allows them to stand up in the House and say, we don't mean that, when in fact their intention is to do exactly that later on. And that's what we see here. We see that this is a bill that can be used against people that simply did not have the money to either pay their fines, which results in a warrant, or failed to attend court, which again results in a warrant. Both of those situations are situations that are extremely related to the issue of poverty. People that simply do not have the resources to arrive at court. So people that simply do not have the money to pay for their fines that they have. And I know that working closely with the Indigenous community, they're very concerned about these kind of provisions, because whenever you put these kind of provisions in, inevitably they're used against Indigenous people at a much greater rate than they are used against non-Indigenous people. And they're very concerned about this. And this is why I say this is a poison pill, and this is why I cannot support this. Because what they're saying is you just opened a great big wide open door to go after poor Indigenous people. Now, I heard the minister said, that's fear-mongering, but I'm telling you that members of the Indigenous community are telling me they are afraid. And I'm reporting that here in the House. They're afraid that, like so many other provisions that have happened in our legislation over the last 100+ years, that it is really legislation that is designed to go after their community. And they remind me that this government brought in what was known as Bill 1, which was the Infrastructure Protection Act, which was to say you weren't allowed to protest on the public property, such as Alberta highways. And then, all of a sudden, the Coots border crossing happened, and did they use it against all these white folks down there? No, they did not. And so the Indigenous community says, what we're seeing here is a bill that was designed to pretend to look at protecting the people of the province of Alberta, but was not used against one group of people, but certainly was designed to be used against others. And they say that they know within their community that that bill was designed to prevent Indigenous people from protesting when they want to protest infrastructure. And they say, here it is again. Here we have another situation where we're going to see a differential application because the minister failed in his job to define in this act what a prescribed offense was. And so now we're in the same position where Indigenous people across this province are saying we are going to see this used repeatedly against Indigenous people who are living in poverty because they simply cannot afford to either attend court because they can't afford the cost of coming down from northern Alberta into Edmonton in order to arrive at court on time and therefore get a warrant against them for failure to appear, or people who just simply cannot afford to pay their fines. They know this is going to happen. And I just want to take us back to Victor Hugo. This is 160 years ago that in civil society we defined the notion that you should not criminalize poverty. That we need to instead, we need to use these opportunities to try to invite people back into the good society that we are trying to create for all citizens. That's what we should be doing. But instead, this government creates yet another bill which has under its tone is one of the retribution model. And that is that we create laws in order to punish those people who we don't like, those people who somehow make us feel uncomfortable, those people who somehow have violated our sense of what we'd like to have happen in society without any understanding about why they committed those offenses, why they do those things that make us feel uncomfortable, and how we can actually change the way we engage with those people so that they become part of society in a successful way. A justice-based model that Victor Hugo 160 years ago was asking for. So it tells you how far back this government's thinking is. It's more than 160 years old. And we've seen this time and time again, this notion that this government doesn't understand what it's like to come from a background of poverty, a background of trauma. And I can tell you that the Indigenous people certainly have had that experience and tell me all the time that they know from that experience that they're going to have a disproportionate number of people to whom this legislation applies, and they think that is just a continuation of the colonial oppression that they've experienced over all the years that Canada has been in existence, and have asked us to take the time to stop and consult with them and say, is this going to be used in a way that is going to be terrible for your community? And if it is, then how do we go about changing it so it doesn't do that? But no consultation has happened with the Indigenous community. I don't think this minister can give me a single example of going to one of the treaty organizations and saying, we're going to slip this into the bill. Can the treaty organization tell me what they think about this section of the bill? And what are the concerns? How might we address those concerns before we actually write the bill so that it doesn't have a differential effect on Indigenous people? And they didn't do that. They failed to do their work. They failed to define it properly in the bill. And now they've set themselves up, so I have no choice but to vote against this bill. Because I absolutely do not believe in the criminalization of poverty. I do believe that more Indigenous people are in jail because of the history of the treatment of Indigenous people, not because of bad choices by individuals. because it's the legacy of trauma. It's the legacy of poverty. It's the legacy of violence that has resulted in the situation where a lot of Indigenous people have indeed broken the law. They've broken the law because they had few options. They've broken the law because they had few resources. They've broken the law because they had so much trauma they could not come to the place where they could make the decisions we would hope all Albertans would be able to make. And now we're going to punish them for that. We're going to punish them for acting out the legacy of the history of colonization and traumatic oppression that the Indigenous people have experienced here in this province. Again, the same thing that we have argued time and time again in this House. If you simply go out and you have a consultation and you want to do this kind of thing, can you not work with the Indigenous community to actually look at how can we make sure we can write this in such a way that it actually won't become a weapon against the Indigenous community? Now, many in the Indigenous community will admit that there is a higher rate of acts such as violence perpetrated by Indigenous people than other people in the province. But they say there's a reason why that is. And what we should be doing is creating legislation that addresses that underlying reason. And if you do that, if you actually go after what is the cause of the trauma, how do the people respond to trauma, how do we get them to get to a place where they're no longer responding in this negative kind of way? So even if they admit, yeah, there are probably more Indigenous people that have committed certain types of violence than other groups of people, it's still not okay because of why they committed that violence. And even if you say, oh, we're only going to use this in specific cases, I can guarantee you now, if you keep any race-based data on who this is used against, you're going to see an overrepresentation of Indigenous people. Which is, again, why we on this side of the House asked for the collection of race-based data by this government. And again, this government refused to do that. Refused our bill that would have the police collect race-based data so we could see if indeed this kind of legislation ended up by being imposed against Indigenous people in a disproportionate way. And I can absolutely guarantee you that it is going to be. And I can absolutely guarantee you that the Indigenous community will feel it is yet a continuation of the colonization that they've experienced in this country for many years. And so I cannot, in good faith, support this bill, even though there are other things in this bill that I'd be happy to have happen. I wish they would stop putting together these bills, this thing they've learned from the Americans, to put all these disconnected things together so that you can't oppose one piece without opposing the whole bill. And unfortunately, I'm in that position. In my last minute, I also want to say I'm very disappointed on their stance with regard to the WCB. Their argument has simply been that it has not been a major issue because there have not been that many firefighters that have died so far. They often cite the number of one. And my position is always, are you telling me that you agree with the principle, but it hasn't affected enough people yet for you to care? And I want to know how many people have to die before you care. What's the number? Give me the number. It's not one, apparently. It's going to be more. It's not a future forward-looking piece of legislation. It's saying in the past, it wouldn't have had that much effect. It certainly would have had an effect on that family. And it would have had an effect on all the other ones that right now are struggling through the process of working with a very difficult red tape process at WCB in order to get their benefits appropriately forwarded to them. And I wish this government would take the chance to say, look, we don't want people to be in that place, so we'll create the legislation to actually make it possible. We know they did it in Ontario, so they can certainly do it here. Mr. Speaker, I've been very concerned about the approach this government has taken to the people of Alberta and the very deep lack of compassion for the experiences they have and the lack of desire to create structures that invite people to the greatest level of success and fulfillment of their desires as citizens of this province. I certainly wish they would change, and I am going to oppose this bill. Thank you.
Are there others? The Honourable the Deputy Premier, followed by the member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise and speak to proposed changes to Bill 9, specifically the proposed changes to the Public Works Act. Working with the Ministry of Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction, Alberta Infrastructure has proposed an amendment to the Public Works Act that will expedite regulations and allow our government to respond to changes more quickly and more straightforwardly. We are actively listening to our industry partners, and we have heard their feedback. It's time for an update of the Public Works Act, which hasn't been updated since 2010. And a lot's changed since 2010, including technology and process improvements within the construction industry. We also need to be agile and able to change with the times. So Section 34 of the Public Works Act currently states that Lieutenant Governor and Council may make regulations respecting any matters that the Lieutenant Governor and Council considers necessary or advisable to carry out effectively the intent and purpose of this Act. Essentially what that means is that we currently need to adopt or amend the Public Works Act. Regulation and order in Council is required, or in different language, an order passed by Cabinet. That can be a long process, especially when the whole purpose of amending a regulation is to provide clarity and streamline regulatory requirements. In the proposed change outlined in this legislation, the regulation-making authority will be updated from the Lieutenant Governor and Council to the Minister responsible for the Public Works Act. This is a simple change. The proposed amendments to the Act will make the government's regulation-making process faster and more agile. Any future changes to the Act will be done in consultation with other ministries and partner organizations that would be impacted. We're also working with the Minister of Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction, who is leading the consultation on extending the rules of prompt payment to Government of Alberta projects. To be clear, the proposed changes in Bill 9 do not consider any changes to the Prompt Pay Construction Lien Act, but Alberta Infrastructure will continue to work with partner ministries, as well as organizations and stakeholders within the industry to explore further opportunities to reduce red tape and streamline government processes. The change we're making here is in direct consultation with and in the best interest of our industry partners. Over my past 6 months or so in this chair as Minister of Infrastructure, I have been all across the province meeting with our construction industry partners. Anything from a quick coffee chat to a formal AGM events, I've heard loud and clear from industry that we cannot lead with government fixes and procedural corrections only. We need to foster and build relationships with our key partners. That means this is listening to feedback, taking a good look at how we currently do things and what works and what doesn't. In the end, we have the best regulatory environment in the world, and I do believe we're on our way there. But now we need to prioritize relationships between the government and industry. This, Mr. Speaker, is a small achievable change in the Public Works Act and is an excellent first step to fulfilling our commitments by listening to Alberta's construction industry and acting. I'm confident that the changes that we are proposing in Bill 9 will expedite the making of regulations and allow government to respond to changes more quickly, helping Alberta Infrastructure and industry partners to deliver public infrastructure safely, on time, and on budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to join the debate on Bill 9, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2023. And this is an omnibus bill, which, we're pretty used to from the UCP government. I mean, there often used to be some decorum in that, not putting 15 pieces of legislation in one bill, but the UCP does this repeatedly. And certainly, if the NDP did that in government, they were often outraged and said it was too much to have in one bill and we need to debate these bills separately. But cavalierly, we get these bills all the time with this government. So certainly they are having, I guess, no integrity in their concerns that they presented previously. So yes, it's an omnibus bill, and like my colleagues, the MLA from Castle Downs and the MLA from Rutherford, if we're looking specifically at one piece of this legislation, the part that amends income support, it is about the criminalization of poverty, which is what this bill does, and my colleagues spoke very well about that. And I know that the Minister of Technology and Innovation stood up and very forcefully indicated, no, it's not just about warrants, it's about violent offenders, and that's who this is about, and that's who we would deny income support to. But gosh, when I look in here, it doesn't say anything about violent offenders. On page 21, it says, the director must, subject to the regulations, refuse to provide income support and benefits to an applicant or recipient under Part 2, Division 1, when notified that a warrant for the arrest of the applicant or recipient has been issued in respect of prescribed offense and the warrant has not been executed. Nothing about these are warrants for violent offenders. So if indeed that was the intent of the government, then why is it not here? Because warrants can be for, not paying some kind of a fine. Warrants can be for, jaywalking. So there can be a whole, diverse kind of warrant. So if it is indeed for that, for the violent offenders, then why isn't it in the legislation? Because this gives the government a wide berth to do whatever they want with folks who happen to be poor, people who are receiving income support. So we can deny them that if they have a warrant of any kind. This is not specific at all. And so it definitely is the criminalization of poverty. But I just want to ask the government, why stop there? Why not people who are in Alberta Seniors Benefit, or perhaps that's already included in here, and I haven't read all the subsections. That's income support. What about people on AISH? Why aren't they included in here? I mean, why don't you just go for it and take a whole bunch of people off if this is what you want? But why are you picking on this particular group of people? Can you help me know that? Or why do you deny other people other services that the government gives? Why don't you take people who need some kind of health support? They need to go to the hospital, but they have a warrant out. Well, they can't go to a hospital. Why are you picking on people in income support? Perhaps the minister responsible can explain that to us, because it does definitely look like it is focusing on people who are vulnerable. The people who are in income support, they need food, they need shelter, they often need personal items, sometimes medical and other benefits. Oftentimes they're supporting children. A lot of times they're women. And as my honourable colleague from Rutherford talked about, a lot of times they are Indigenous people. And that's because of our legacy of colonization, something that, we certainly don't want to continue, and we want to empower people. And income supports are meant to also provide some training, hopefully to support people to develop independence and self-sufficiency. So it doesn't make any sense that someone is struggling, and he may have a warrant out, that they would be denied funding for food, shelter, clothing. These are the basics. It is unfair, and it's not very becoming of a government that repeatedly says we care about our most vulnerable. I don't see that. I see a barrier after barrier going up in front of people who are struggling in our province. And, I really challenge the government to make some sense of this, have the minister speak about this. Why specifically are you saying this for people who are on income support? What's the rationale for that? Why not deny all public servants to Albertans with warrants, if that's what you want to do? Why are you picking on this group of people? And then another section later on in this legislation, still on page 21, it says people are authorized, the minister responsible for Schedule 9 to the Government Organization Act is authorized to disclose information, including personal information, for the purposes of Section 15.1. So personal information can be shared of these people. Well, usually there's a pretty high bar of private information is not disclosed. And just because someone is on income support doesn't mean that their information should be shared with other authorities. Why is it that people who are poor all of a sudden don't have rights like the rest of us? I'm hoping the minister did his due diligence and talked with the Privacy Commissioner about this legislation, and that indeed that was seen as following the rules regarding that, because in my reading of that, it seems like that should be not done. People need to be, their confidentiality needs to be respected. So it is, again, just about taking away the rights of people who are poor. And I know the government does repeatedly say that they want to support vulnerable people in our society, but this legislation is showing us very clearly that it's not. And some of the rationale that was explained by the Minister of Technology and Innovation was that it was because, we don't want to be supporting people who are violent offenders. Well, I agree with that. But why doesn't the legislation say that? It doesn't say that at all. It just says someone with a warrant. So it's gone far beyond what the minister has indicated. And, I just wonder why this particular program, this particular income support program is being targeted for this type of disclosure and denial of services. I mean, it just absolutely seems abhorrent and unfair for the people who are poor in our province. And certainly as a social worker for more than 30 years, my job has been to take down those barriers. And having worked within government's programs and without, those were some of the biggest challenges, was the uncaring government that did not want to really support people. They wanted to judge people who were poor, judge people who maybe were victims of domestic violence, judge people who, were newcomers and they didn't always speak the language and they had barriers to employment and therefore lived in poverty. So I've worked my life to make sure that people had access, but I see a government here who says one thing and does another. And certainly we can see it very clearly with their decisions around the opioid crisis, our drug poisoning crisis in our province. They make it harder and harder for people to even stay alive by closing of supervised consumption sites, the reduction of harm reduction, and the moving of Edmonton's detox way out to Alberta Hospital, making it so hard for people to access that. So, despite some of the words of the government that they want to support people to overcome these challenges, really, if you look closely, you see how they are actually impeding people from overcoming the challenges that are facing them. So certainly, it is disturbing to me to see a government target this particular program. And, as I said, and I'm, of course, facetious in my comments about, well, why don't we just not let people use the health system if they've got a warrant? But, of course, not all people who use the health system are poor. Some of them are, for sure. So I really ask the government to think about why they would leave out that very specific information, about violent offenders and just put a general warrants. Anyone with a warrant can be denied financial support. And why is that not clear? Or perhaps, sadly, I'm right. And my colleagues are correct in that this government really doesn't want to support the most vulnerable people. It wants to make life harder for people who are vulnerable. And, that is a sad day, but it seems like we're at that sad day. And I think with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll end my comments.
Are there others? The honourable member for Calgary, Bular-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to Bill 9, which is a red tape reduction amendment, Statute Amendment Act 2023. And this is again an omnibus piece of legislation that amends 15 pieces of legislation. And I don't know whether it reduces red tape or not, but it certainly reduces debate in this House, curtails debate in this House. Many of the changes contained in it could be standalone pieces of legislation worth over time, worth debating here. For instance, this bill adds a new section in the WCB legislation to exempt firefighters engaged in the Fort McMurray fire from the latency period on presumptive cancers. We all know that Fort McMurray fire was one of the worst natural disaster in Alberta's history, and many brave firefighters, first responders, put themselves in the harm way to save people in Fort McMurray, to save Fort McMurray, and they deserve to be recognized for that. They deserve to be compensated for the harm that resulted as a result of them engaged in fighting that fire. And recently, Ontario made that coverage retroactive to 1960. I think Alberta can certainly do that, and no one who was engaged in that fire should have to fight for WCB, how they got that cancer. So they deserve better than this. So we will be introducing an amendment later on to make those changes retroactive. As it stands now, that change doesn't go far enough. Another change in it is that government is reversing a change, allowing the provincial government to terminate agreements without cause with a minimum of 90 days notice to the City of Calgary or City of Edmonton. This was initially implemented by this UCP government so they can get out of Green Line work in Calgary. And when they brought forward that change, many of us here were in this legislature. Government was asked if they have consulted with anyone from City of Calgary, any other city that was getting impacted, and there was no answer. They used their majority to ram through that change. And now, all they're doing, they're reversing their own bad decision that was bad then, and that we opposed then. So it's a good change. Government should not have done it in the first place. Another change that my colleagues talked about, and Minister of Service Alberta Technology responded to that as well, that the director must, subject to the regulation, refuse to provide income support and benefit to an applicant or recipient under Part 2, Division 1, when notified that a warrant for the arrest of the applicant or recipient has been issued in respect of a prescribed offense, and the warrant has not been executed. There are a number of problems with this provision. As my colleague from Edmonton Rutherford said, it perpetuates, legalizes poverty. Because warrant can be issued for a number of reasons. And it may or may not be the case that the person who has a warrant is convicted. In our justice system, Charter of Rights and Freedom uphold the presumption of innocence before somebody is convicted. So that may offend the Charter as well. The second problem with that is that although the Minister said that it will be only for prescribed dangerous offenders, but there is nothing in this legislation that shows what those offenses will be. And UCP is asking us and asking Albertan to trust them on this. And their record shows that they cannot be trusted. and they should not be trusted. Those who are on income support, if you have twice the amount of what the income support is on a monthly basis, you don't qualify. So essentially, if you have $1,000, $1,500, you do not qualify for income support. That's how our income support program works. And those who are on income support, that support, that benefit, gives them some money to be able to eat, and in some cases be able to have some shelter. And this provision is essentially cutting those individuals, the most poor among us, from that support as well. That's another cruel decision from this clueless government, and that cannot and should not be supported. And as my colleague from Edmonton, Rutherford, said, that it will target Indigenous communities. It will target person of color communities, because they are the ones who are among those who are among the poorest in this society. And without any information what those prescribed offenses will be, it's still a bad public policy. We should not be criminalizing, we should not be perpetuating poverty. And as was mentioned, that government passed this Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. On the face of it, it was to protect our main infrastructure. And it was brought forward by the government because then Premier was offended by some youth making TikTok on a railway line. And Indigenous communities protesting in British Columbia. And at that time, Indigenous communities did share those concerns that this bill will target them and nobody else. And that turned out to be true, because when Coote's border was blockaded for 21 days, not that this government didn't mention that piece of legislation, but some from their caucus also visited Coote blockade. Another change is to amend the Petty Trespass Act and the Trespass to Premises Act so that it can apply to federal government agents. Again, another change that no one is asking for. And even government doesn't know what's the rationale for this. On March 1st, government House leader was at a presser downstairs. I was present there. And when asked about what's prompting this change, and the government House leader said, and I quote, "We are seeing federal employees trespass onto private land in Alberta, and as a result of that, we don't think that that's appropriate," end quote. That's government House leader in the morning of March 1, 2023. Later that afternoon, Justice Department spokesperson said this, and I quote, "There have been no confirmed cases of trespass by federal government employees in Alberta," end quote. Government House Leader is saying that government is seeing federal employees trespassing onto Alberta lands. Justice Department is saying that they have no evidence of such trespassing. This change does nothing other than putting federal employees and their families at risk. It will jeopardize their safety. And when government has no evidence, when government's own Justice Department says they have no evidence of anybody trespassing, they should not be passing these kind of legislation. Although there are a few things that we can put our support behind, but there are these things that we cannot support. And for that reason, I urge my colleagues and all members of this House to oppose this piece of legislation.
Honourable members, are there others? Seeing none, I am prepared to call on the Minister to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Service Alberta Red Tape Reduction has waived closure of debate. On the question before the Assembly for second reading of Bill 9, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2023, all those in favour of the motion for second reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 9, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2023 is now read a second time. Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 10, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023, debate adjourned. Member Irwin speaking.
Honourable members, before the Assembly, Bill 10, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023. Is there anyone wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on Bill 10 here this evening. For the first time for myself, anyhow. And we, just looking through this bill, which we just got, the biggest concern that the official opposition has, generally, and me specifically, is that it enacts the creation of this Alberta Fund, which is access to $1.4 billion that the minister can use in any number of ways for one-time funding. And so, newsflash, Mr. Speaker, of course, we are just on the cusp of an election, and the UCP government arms themselves with a $1.4 billion one-time spending bill in this Bill 10, and it seems like it's fairly obvious opportunity for the government to try to buy their way into the next election. And so, I think that Albertans have been observing this government engaged in this kind of activity already with this budget that they just put forward. It's a substantial budget, and completely out of keeping with the language and the direction that this government has used over the last 3.5 years. And then with an about turn of quite a substantial budget that's just on the floor here now. And then plus another $1.4 billion activated for one-time spending, presumably to try to cover whatever places the government desperately will try to look to buy the favor of Albertans. And so, this is wrong on a number of different fronts, Mr. Speaker, not the least of which being that, we are entrusted to ensure that we spend money for the people of Alberta and for saving for the future for the people of Alberta, and stewards of both the land and the resources that we have here within our boundaries, and so on. And so this whole idea of rushing to election spending within a few weeks right, is probably goes on the wrong side of all of those principles, all of those responsible things that this House and this members of this House should observe. The idea of thoughtful spending and saving over time. The concept of ensuring that you are just and equal in the dispensation of those funds, or the saving of those funds, or the preservation of the resources that we have available to us. None of those things happen with this Bill 10. Quite the opposite. It's like you're opening up the floodgates to just desperately try to cover off whatever the government thinks that they can deal with in the last few weeks before an election. And so that is the main concern I think that we have with this this bill. And of course, the regular questions do apply, Mr. Speaker. Like, who did you ask about this to say that, this is what we need, Albertans, this is what we need at this juncture in our history, to give the government access to more than $1 billion to announce in a month before an election. I mean, you'd have a hard time finding the people that would concur with that judgment, I think. And I really don't think that there was anything that resembles consultation on that. But you can always try, I suppose. And I would ask the government who they did ask that they thought that that was such a good idea. And really, to what end? Besides the naked, attempt to buy people's votes before an election, that's really just so obvious. And when I've been out talking to Albertans across the province, all over the place, really, this is the recurring theme that I hear from people, and is that they will say some version of like, do the UCP take us to be fools, right? Do they think that we are so easily bought? Do they think that we can't remember what happened in the last 1,000 days or more, that suddenly is erased in the last, 60 days before an election? I mean, all of those things are just, that people take offense to it. And of course, you don't have to even remind people, but it bears reminding that it's not the government's money either. It's the people of Alberta's money in the first place. And so, being tried to buy the favor of someone with their own money, right? Again, it doesn't feel, it feels bad. It feels dirty, and it doesn't concur with the best practices of democracy or of what's common sense tells you is right or wrong. Is quite frankly. So those are the things that I'm hearing. And then, that was before Bill 10 came out. So, I mean, Lord knows what they're going to think about now, right? That was just with the budget. And then, of course, this Amendment Act is clarifying some of just the depths to which this budget does head down that path. I mean, there are other sections in here that I really don't have much of a problem with, right? But, it's again, as my honourable colleague from Edmonton Riverview described, is that you have these bills with many different facets to them, and Lord, dollars to donuts, there'll be one element in there that completely negates all the other things and makes it impossible to support that bill. In this case, it's the Alberta Fund $1.4 billion one-time spending powers that this bill does give us. I mean, the other sections that I do see here, just offhand, I mean, the thing that jumps out at me was, of course, with the Alberta Heritage and Savings Fund, right, Trust Fund Act, and I have sat on that board previously and presently, and I did, like to see that we have some provision to save money in the Heritage Trust Fund. I believe it's $750 million with this bill, and so, this is what it was designed to do, under a much more prudent and reasonable government that started the Heritage Trust Fund concept. And, it's not just to save money for the future. It also helps to pay for budgets every single year because you get interest off that. You can use that interest to pay for programs that we all benefit from. And, of course, it does create a rainy day fund. And it has an added benefit too of the, if you have really a lot of money, that you're not distorting the economy, literally, not just provincially, but even nationally, by, just spending it all in some sort of way. But, I mean, that said, you put $750 million into the Heritage Trust Fund on one hand, then you got a $1.4 billion thing that you can spend in 8 weeks. I mean, that kind of negates that reasonable practice of saving for a rainy day and not distorting the economy on one hand, and then, of course, building something even larger, which could do both of those things, no problem, right? So these are the initial thoughts that I've had around Bill 10. I think that we can be looking at it. Of course, there's more than just me around here, so we can hear from other people to see if the analysis proves correct. But, it does have that glaring Alberta Funds Section 9 in there that raises very large red flags for not just the official opposition, but the general public, economists, and anyone who's concerned about the future of our province here. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will allow us other time for people to speak, and I welcome to participate in the debate. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening, which very well could be one of my last opportunities here in the Assembly. With that, speaking to Bill 10, the Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023, and much like the previous member, the member from Edmonton Northwest, I also have concerns with this legislation, primarily focused around the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act amendments within this piece of legislation. Now, when we look at even the Alberta.ca, the Alberta government's website, recognizing some of the changes that are being proposed in here, specifically on this act, a few points down, we see that this act will set policy for the allocation of surplus cash with at least half going toward debt repayment. I think that's fair, Mr. Speaker. Reading past that, the rest would be allocated to a new Alberta fund, which would be used only to fund additional contributions to the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, fair, and beyond that, additional debt repayment and one-time spending initiatives. So that is where the previous member spoke to, where I also have concerns, this idea of one-time spending initiatives. I think that, again, we should be doing everything we can to be transparent and accountable with the dollars that we are spending across this province. Especially when we see ourselves in an opportunity for surplus. And of course, this government has found themselves with a surplus, primarily the majority of the reason being the price of oil. And so, again, that's fair. We should be considering how we are spending those funds. But the fact is there's been so many opportunities for this government to invest in stability in this province. Just thinking back to some of the decisions of this government, and there's been many, Mr. Speaker, that have affected primarily the lowest income Albertans. When we look at the decision of this government to de-index AISH early in their term, the decision to de-index personal income taxes, Mr. Speaker, the decision to cut off beneficiaries of low-income seniors to receive benefits for medical coverage. I mean, the list is long, Mr. Speaker, of the decisions that this government has made that have hurt vulnerable Albertans. And so now when we find ourselves in a situation where there is dollars left over, again, primarily because of the price of oil, but also because of some of the decisions that this government has made to cut off benefits and supplies to low-income Albertans, we find ourselves in a situation with a surplus. And instead of potentially looking at how we can spend this in a more accountable and transparent way, whether it's looking at capital plans, whether it's looking at those benefits that have been decreased previously, unfortunately, we see this government going down the path of one-time spending initiatives starting April 1st, right before an election. Mr. Speaker. And I think that we've heard previously, whether from this Premier or the previous Premier under the UCP, the importance of not spending government dollars during or close to an election cycle. And unfortunately, we see this government going down that path with absolutely zero accountability for those dollars. You know, I think back to some of the other decisions that this government has made, primarily looking at decisions of this education minister around the complete lack of funding specific to Edmonton Public School Board. And of course, you know, that goes past just our Edmonton Public School Board. It goes to the Catholic School Board in Edmonton. It goes to municipalities across the province and the school boards that have the important work of funding education across the province. And unfortunately, this government has done anything but support those initiatives of building new schools, of ensuring that there's dollars to put teachers in those classrooms. And again, I think back to the rhetoric of the education minister, and Mr. Speaker, coming back to Bill 10 and the Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023 and this idea of one-time spending initiatives, and instead of ensuring that we are properly and adequately funding the dollars that should be designated more systematically to things like education, to things like healthcare. And we continue to hear this rhetoric from the education minister around how the NDP didn't fund schools in Edmonton nearly as close to how this current UCP government has done so, Mr. Speaker. And it would be completely laughable if it wasn't so sad for the residents in my community and communities across this province. You know, just looking back to some of the accomplishments, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that there is quite a bit here, and I'll do my best to be quick, but just thinking back to our investments in education and to schools in Edmonton specific to the public school board. I mean, we saw the funding for Alita Patterson, Alex Janvier, Garth Worthington, Dr. Ann Anderson, Thelma Shalafu, Soraya Hafiz, Jan Reimer, Kim Hung, Shauna Sinika, Michael Fair, Donald Getty, Mr. Speaker, I'm close, I promise, Sven Hansen, David Thomas King, Leela Fallman, Hilary Hamden, Constable Daniel Woodall, Ivor Dent. These are all schools that were funded by our government. Some of them were modernizations. Many of them were brand new schools. And while I appreciate some of these schools were finished under this UCP government, and they would love to take credit for that, in fact, they were funded completely by our government. And so when Albertans go to tally up how many schools, you know, we can look at my community. The minister, I believe 2 years ago, committed one Catholic school to be built, and now that's set for 26-27. This UCP government hasn't even been able to build one school in my community in their entire term, when we built at least 2 or 3, possibly more, Mr. Speaker, not including the many other schools across West Edmonton that were built. So when we look at opportunities to invest in our community in a more systemic way, in a more accountable and transparent way, we have mechanisms like our school boards, like our health authorities and municipalities that should be able to access this funding, but instead this government is going to take it upon themselves to create a $1.4 billion slush fund named the Alberta Fund, Mr. Speaker, and spend that as they see fit right before an election. And so it's deeply concerning to me because there's no accountability here. Again, Mr. Speaker, we don't know what criteria this government is planning to use. There is no assurances that is going to be dispersed equally across the province or used on the communities with the most need out there. And instead, we are left to guess at what this money is going to be spent on. And again, when we look at the timeline for this, the lack of criteria, it sure seems like this government is going to use it as an opportunity to get themselves reelected. And I don't think that that is how we should be spending Albertans' dollars across this province. Now, we tie this into the millions and millions of dollars that this government is using to advertise their so-called affordability payments. And again, we see this government leaving so many Albertans out. No accountability to how this money is going to be spent. We see students across this province not being able to access any of this funding on top of previous decisions of this government to hike interest rates on tuition, increase tuition to historic levels. There's so many reasons why this government should have been more accountable in how this money was going to be spent. And I would say that in many ways, this slush fund that the government is creating is on the backs of vulnerable Albertans who shouldn't have seen their benefits cut in the first place, who shouldn't have seen their tuition cut in the first place, who shouldn't have seen schools not being built. And now this government has found themselves in a surplus situation because of all those cuts that they've made, and they are going to be unaccountable in how they spend the money that has been left over. And so, as the previous member from Edmonton Northwest said, I think that there's pieces within this legislation that are reasonable and potentially tackling some of the more housekeeping issues that have been brought forward to them from stakeholders, and I can appreciate that. But the fact is, when you tie it in with this unaccountable slush fund, there's just no way that I could see myself supporting this. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity. I will take my seat.
There are others. The honourable member for Edmonton Castle Downs is next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise this evening to speak to Bill 10, the Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023. Before I get into that, I just wanted to acknowledge what the previous speaker had mentioned about this potentially being his last time speaking in the chamber. And I need to say how important it is that his voice has been part of this assembly for 8 years, and hearing the incredible advocacy that he does on behalf of Albertans is so impactful. And I needed to start with that, because that has been the voice on this side of the chamber for the 8 years that I've been elected, and knowing that's what this side of the House represents is such an honor for me to work alongside these incredible individuals. Earlier on this evening, we heard from the member from Edmonton Rutherford, who had also made reference to perhaps this being one of the last times speaking in the chamber. And I'm reminded, Mr. Speaker, of the countless hours of debate that have been held in this chamber, and the incredible, powerful stories of Albertans that we've heard from this side of the House, and how their stories are what we're fighting for. Individuals in Alberta. When we have a piece of legislation, the Financial Statutes Amendment Act, that we're debating here tonight, having that reminder that we're here for Albertans. We're here to talk about people and how we can better their lives. And it's concerning, Mr. Speaker, when on this side of the House, those are the stories that we're sharing. Those are the values that we hold. Those are the policies that we want to see brought into place that actually make a difference for Albertans who are struggling, Mr. Speaker. And instead, we're in the chamber tonight at 10 to 9 talking about a piece of legislation that essentially gives $1.4 billion of slush funds for this government to buy votes. Now, that is such a huge contrast between what both parties are talking about. I hear members on this side of the chamber talking about wanting to make sure that we leave this place, leaving Alberta a better place. And I'm incredibly privileged to stand alongside these members that are sharing tonight and have shared for the last 8 years that I've been elected. And it gives me strength, Mr. Speaker, to speak about what matters. To have this piece of legislation before us tonight is quite frustrating when we know that this government isn't fooling Alberta when they're putting in a $1.4 billion election campaign slush fund. Section 9 creates the Alberta Fund. That's what this government's focusing on. This government is focusing on trying to buy Alberta's votes. Last night, Mr. Speaker, we were in the chamber. For those of you that weren't following along at home, maybe were watching the Oilers game, we were debating the supplementary supply 2023-2024. And just like tonight's Bill 10, we were talking about ways that this government is campaigning on the public dime. We haven't heard from this government any sort of believable justification as to why this piece of legislation was brought forward, and tonight why they believe that $1.4 billion that can be accessed on April 1st is in the best interest for Albertans right now, as opposed to, giving access to a slush fund to the Premier and the UCP. It's concerning that that's what we're debating right now, Mr. Speaker. This is another piece of legislation, just like the piece of legislation, Bill 9, that we were speaking to right before this, that has more than one portfolio being impacted. And it's a little slip in the legislation that they're hoping that people won't pay attention to. There are pieces of this legislation that make sense. The children's services piece, culture has some good things in there. But there's two major pieces of this that are quite concerning. And I think that it creates some significant questions when we see a government giving themselves a slush fund and calling it the Alberta Fund. That's quite concerning, Mr. Speaker. This money that they're allocating could have been spent in so many other ways, Mr. Speaker. We're in a healthcare crisis, despite what this government and Premier continue to say isn't true. We've heard heartbreaking stories from all across the province of people that haven't been able to access a family doctor for years. People that are waiting incredible amounts of time for surgeries. Hospitals that don't have physicians. ERs that are shut down. That's where this money should be spent. Instead, we see under the Financial Statutes Amendment Act, them creating the Alberta Fund, which is essentially a slush fund for them to buy votes. A $1.4 billion slush fund. It's clear what the priorities of this government are, Mr. Speaker. We have watched for 4 years as they've attacked doctors, as they fired educational workers, as they refuse to listen to nurses and healthcare practitioners. Instead, they're making sure that their friends are taken care of, and this piece of legislation allows them to do just that. Effective April 1st, they're able to use taxpayer money called the Alberta Fund to fund one-time initiatives for one-time funding announcements. I fail to see how this is anything but desperation before a campaign. It's certainly not helping Albertans. It's not helping the countless amount of post-secondary students that I have reaching out to my office, stressed. The cost of tuition has gone up under this government. The cost of living in general has gone up. This government brags about their affordability. Well, it doesn't impact post-secondary students. They have no access to that money. If they do not have a child, they don't get access to it. If they don't drive a car, they can't access that. So when they're saying it does impact, it absolutely does not. This government should just simply be doing better, Mr. Speaker. When we look at Section 9, it's hidden amongst quite a bit of legislation in here that they're changing and making adjustments to. But I would argue that $1.4 billion for a slush fund is a desperate attempt from the Premier and the UCP to campaign on taxpayer dollars. And I think that Albertans know what this is about, Mr. Speaker. They see the announcements with no funding behind them. They see these statements from governments that they're helping, that the healthcare crisis is over. But when you talk to Albertans, they know that that's not true, Mr. Speaker. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will end my time, and I encourage any member of the government to stand up and defend this $1.4 billion slush fund. They're chirping on the other side. Now, I would encourage them when it's their time to speak to get up and defend this, because honestly, Mr. Speaker, I don't see any way possibly that can be defended. And with that, I will end my remarks. Thank you.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie is next.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise this evening and defend Bill 10 and talk about Bill 10 and the merits of Bill 10. I'm honoured to rise to discuss the Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023, Mr. Speaker. We'll start with record spending in healthcare to province-wide affordability measures. Budget 2023 focuses on securing Alberta's future for generations to come, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of that. By growing the economy, creating good-paying jobs, and I think that the Minister of Finance said today there's 100,000 jobs waiting for people to come to Alberta to fill, and that's just the start, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud of that. By strengthening education, by expanding healthcare, keeping communities safe, Budget 2023 addresses many of the most urgent needs we are hearing from every corner of our great province. To effectively answer these calls and secure Alberta's future, Mr. Speaker, fiscal stability and responsibility must be upheld, clearly defined and absolute, and that's why I'm happy to support Bill 10. Albertans deserve stability and confidence in the fact that no matter what storms we face in the future, we will be as prepared as possible. As we've learned through this term, we can't predict the future. We don't know what's coming next. But we can do everything in our power to ensure Albertans are taken care of no matter what challenges may come their way. They deserve to know that our province's prosperity is not contingent on uniquely volatile revenue that's impacted by global markets and events beyond the government's control, no matter who that government is. That said, we need to focus on what is in our control. That is, Mr. Speaker, our expense decisions and our ability to implement fiscal frameworks that provide flexibility for revenue swings while helping Alberta avoid past mistakes. And I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, for the record, that earlier in the House today, a member opposite talked about how the only reason we balanced the budget was because of oil revenue. And I'd be the first person to say that oil revenue certainly helped. There's no question. But that is not the only reason that we balanced the budget. We balanced the budget because we exercised a measure of fiscal discipline unknown in the 4 years before our office. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that our finance minister, I would argue the best finance minister in Alberta's history, he put in these fiscal rules. He put in these fiscal anchors at a time when it was extremely volatile and uncertain, at a time when we were paying other jurisdictions to take our oil. We still stayed the course. And as a result, we balanced not one budget, Mr. Speaker, but two back-to-back budgets, setting a record and a trend that we hope will continue. And that's what Bill 10 is all about, is encouraging and setting guidelines for other governments, future governments, to be held to that same account for the benefit not of us, Mr. Speaker, but of future generations, which is why we're all here. Ultimately, Albertans deserve to know that their future is secure and grounded in fiscal responsibility, preparedness, and stability, and that's what Bill 10 is about, Mr. Speaker. It proposes a new fiscal framework that will provide exactly that. The proposed framework would limit expense increases, except where there are unexpected and uncontrollable circumstances, something like a global pandemic, which hopefully we won't see again for a very long time, Mr. Speaker. Setting limits would allow the government to continue focusing on improving programs and services while ensuring Albertans' hard-earned tax dollars are spent wisely. Aside from certain defined exceptions, and I want to stress that word, defined exceptions, Bill 10 will require all future governments to balance the budget and use surpluses to first pay down debt and then save for the future. I think that's critical, Mr. Speaker. If past administrations had focused on paying down debt, we wouldn't be in the position we're in today. And I'm proud of the record of this government and the work that we've done to start turning that around. It would help guide fiscal decision-making by setting guardrails to achieve and maintain balanced budgets while providing a fair degree of flexibility to deal with revenue swings and unexpected pressures. I think that's reasonable, Mr. Speaker. It would also guide the government's management of cash from future surpluses with a primary focus on debt repayment, investing in the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and providing opportunities for one-time spending initiatives. Ultimately, Bill 10 would bring more stability to the financial outlook of Alberta's government and position our province for a bright future. And as our finance minister has said many times, Alberta's brightest days are ahead, and I believe that, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to say that. I'm thrilled to say that. We've seen some great days in this province. In the 26 years I've lived in this province, there's been some tremendous, tremendous days. But our best days are still ahead. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope, Mr. Speaker. In addition to implementing a new fiscal framework to secure Alberta's future prosperity, Bill 10 also proposes several amendments that address numerous other concerns we've heard from Albertans. Bill 10, if passed, would implement measures from Budget 2023 to help build fiscal stability, attract more investment, Mr. Speaker, because we're already actively attracting and successfully attracting investment, support children and families, cut more red tape, improve provincial funding mechanisms, and make life more affordable for students. To start, Bill 10 proposes amendments to allow the Heritage Fund to retain all of its net income. That is remarkable, Mr. Speaker. Right now, as the legislation sits, it requires a portion of the Heritage Fund's net income to be kept in the fund to protect against inflation. However, any investment income not used for inflation-proofing of the fund must be transferred to general revenue, Mr. Speaker. And this gets interesting. We are learning from the past to secure a brighter future for Albertans. Had we kept all of the previous earnings in the fund from day one, instead of the $18 billion that we currently have in the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, wait for it, Mr. Speaker, we would have nearly $300 billion in the trust fund today. That is remarkable. And I'm sad that we didn't do that past administrations didn't do that. But we can't go back, we can't change what's already happened, but we can go forward. We can set the stage for future generations to enjoy what others didn't plan for. That's why we're putting in this bill. That's why we're proposing these fiscal anchors, this fiscal framework, so that future administrations are held to a higher account on this. Imagine what we could have done through the pandemic if we'd had that kind of money in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. It would have been remarkable. The list of benefits Bill 10 provides for Albertans today and in the future goes on, Mr. Speaker. I'm not done yet. Amendments to the Personal Income Tax Amendment Act would enable changes to the charitable tax credit rating, an increase from 10% at present to 60% for the first $200 of donations. This is scheduled to come into effect retroactively on January 1st of this year. And that's really great, Mr. Speaker, because Albertans, as we know, are very generous. They're a very giving people. And I believe if I have my stats correct, Albertans give more per capita than any other province. That's remarkable. And now we're giving them an even greater financial incentive to do so, Mr. Speaker. Just imagine what will unlock in civil society as that occurs. Bill 10 will cut red tape and save businesses around $7 million a year. $7 million, Mr. Speaker, in mailing costs by giving businesses the ability to provide reporting documents with their shareholders electronically instead of by mail. And I don't want to rag on Canada Post too much, but I will tell you that I've had a lot of interesting mail show up very late, Mr. Speaker, and I think this is a great change to get my documents when I need them, as I need them, instantly. And for a $7 million savings, that's just like the icing on the cake, Mr. Speaker. Changes under Bill 10 would give credit unions the opportunity to provide financial services to residents of border communities and other new customers they cannot currently serve to generate even more revenue through more flexible regulations. Bill 10 proposes amendments that would strengthen the leadership of Horse Racing Alberta by allowing more public and industry representation to manage daily operations and ensure this vibrant part of rural communities continues to thrive. A vibrant part of my rural community of Grand Prairie. Bill 10 also allows Alberta's government to follow through on our commitments to create accessible and affordable post-secondary education. And I have 3 kids in post-secondary education, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy about that. To create the right conditions for Alberta's agri-food sector to be globally competitive. That's a win for all Albertans. To alleviate the financial burdens for those building their forever families through adoption. And to give municipalities across the province the predictable and consistent funding they have long been asking for. And I can attest to that personally, Mr. Speaker, as my role in the ministry. Mr. Speaker, for this and many other reasons, this is why I support Bill 10, so that the concerns we hear from Albertans can be addressed, so that we can continue to learn from our mistakes collectively as a province, so that instead of repeating what's already been done, we go forward with a brighter future for the next generation and the one after that and the one after that, so that we can effectively implement Budget 2023, and most importantly, so that we can ensure Alberta's future will be prosperous and secure for generations to come, Mr. Speaker. I know that's why I ran in 2019, and I'm sure that's why many in this House put the hours in to sit in this chamber, because we want a brighter future for our kids and grandkids and their grandkids. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat, but I'm happy to support Bill 10.
Well said.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there others? The honourable member for Edmonton Rutherford, followed by Calgary Glenmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to Bill 10. I want to start my comments on Bill 10 by just reading a small quote from March 7th, 2012. And the quote was, "You should not be able to use taxpayer dollars for blatant partisan advertising in advance of an election." Something that I completely fundamentally agree with, and perhaps the members on the other side should, because the person who made that statement was a woman who, I was about to say her name and I just realized I can't, was a woman who is now Premier of this province. But of course she said that when she was on the other side of the House. And at the time, the Conservative government was putting together about $1.3 million for advertising campaigns just before the election. And the now Premier, who was opposition at the time, stood up in quite an indignant state to say how repugnant it was that this government at the time was using taxpayer dollars to advertise and to promote their political brand under the guise of government advertising. And here we are, a dozen years later, finding that this government is not only spending the small amount of money, the money that back then that the Wild Rose House leader Rob Anderson referred to as using taxpayer monies as their own campaign piggy bank. But now, instead of just a $1.3 million slush fund, this government has identified about $6.6 million for, quote, developing and implementing the Affordability Action Plan, including an advertising campaign to inform Albertans about affordability initiatives, which is advertising their government policy on the eve of an election. And we know what the now Premier thought about that when she was standing on this side of the floor. And I would certainly love the Premier to stand up and explain why she was terribly wrong then, or why she's terribly wrong now, or why she is speaking one way on one day and another way on another day, which we find happening quite frequently with this particular Premier. I'm very, very concerned that we are in this place of the government taking such a cynical view of Alberta taxpayers' dollars, that they would use such significant amounts of money to create funds for their own purposes that will benefit only them just before an election. The creation of this $1.4 billion election campaign slush fund called the Alberta Fund really is the epitome of cynicism by this government. And I think they should hang their head in shame at the fact that they are supporting this kind of activity. They certainly would not when they were on the opposition side. They certainly would have agreed with their own Premier and called this a slush fund that is unacceptable. And, I think it's fascinating that the government can purport to say that they care about Albertans and they care about how to spend Albertan money, but when it comes time to their own good, to kind of getting what they want out of it, they certainly have a whole bunch of money available. And they're using that money just before an election in a way which I think is really undermining the democratic system that we have in this province. And I think they should certainly have some shame about it. I notice that they don't have money for some other very important things that they could have spent money on. I notice that they don't have money for a public lab to make sure that we have good resources here in this province for identifying responses to viruses and other health crises. They could have easily had one in this province, but this government said we don't have the money for that kind of thing. In fact, not only did they not continue a public lab that had been started before they became the government, but they went to the site and they dug out the beginning cement work that was put in, the foundational work that was being put in, and covered it up at the cost of over $1 million. They were literally using money to cover up what they were taking away from Albertans. And that just seems to be the pattern here in this government. I noticed this government also did not have the money to keep 35,000 educational assistants in the schools when times got tough in this province. That they did not have the money to provide PUF funding for children who are 5 years of age, who need extra supports in the schools so that they can overcome disabilities, overcome learning issues, and be successful at an early age, which we know is directly tied to success later in life. They didn't have the money for that. They didn't have the money for it earlier when they had the single-year greatest deficit budget ever introduced into this province. But they also don't have it now that they got lucky and got a whole bunch of extra money that they didn't count on from the increased price of oil. I noticed they also didn't have money for reducing class sizes, for meeting some of the needs of some of the schools boards across the province of Alberta who are seeking new schools because the population of this province is rising so rapidly that we have thousands and thousands of new students every year, more students than we've ever had before, and the number of schools are simply not keeping up to it. They didn't have money for that, but they certainly had $1.4 billion to create a slush fund for themselves. And I can see that the government members are laughing about this because they know what a joke it is that they're pulling on all of Albertans. They know that they got away with something here and they're going to be able to use that money for personal purposes, which are really political purposes. And I noticed they didn't have money to go to the municipalities and say, look, we know you're struggling. We know because of actions that we have taken over the years by giving a tax holiday to some major corporations, by increasing RCMP officers and putting the taxes on you, putting the costs on you, and doing all kinds of other things for small municipalities, increasing the stress that small municipalities have trying to pay their bills. I was standing in front of the legislature not that long ago with reeves and mayors from all across the province who are here to say their governments are under extreme stress, and a large part of it is created because this government had made decisions that put more expenses onto them and took away some of their resources. Did they have money to fix any of that at this particular time? No, they didn't have money for that. They only had money for a slush fund. I noticed they didn't have money to resolve the problem of massive increases in tuition that we've seen under this government for the last 4 years. We've seen programs at universities go up by as much as 30%. In terms of tuition costs during their tenure here in this house. And do they have money to fix any of that? No, they don't. They don't have money for the people of Alberta. They certainly have money for their own advertising so that they can satisfy their own desire to retain power. That's really what it's all about. I notice they don't have any money for the people who are living on AISH, whose income this government de-indexed who took thousands of dollars out of the pockets of the most poor people in this province, both poor and disabled people. And they took money away from them for 4 years. And have they made any suggestion that perhaps they would give back the money to the people who live on AISH with this surplus that they have? No, they didn't do that. Not only did they take money away from them by de-indexing AISH, they haven't applied any increases.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford has the floor.
Not only did they not deal with the fact that they had de-indexed this AISH payments over the years, but they have not taken this money and said, look, we owe you a couple of $1,000s each, so perhaps we should give that back to you. They could have done that. They chose not to do that. They chose instead to give themselves money. They chose instead to create a slush fund that is really about them using government resources to talk about their program of governance and advertise to the people of the province of Alberta using the money of the people of the province of Alberta. This is something that should simply not be allowed. And in fact, this Premier said it should not be allowed. On March 7th, 2012, this Premier said that that was not an acceptable behavior on the part of the government. And yet now here we have this Premier and this government doing exactly that. It's, you know, you couldn't write fiction about this because people would say that's so unrealistic. No government would act with such malintent. And yet here we have a government that has indeed done exactly that, who have stood up at one time and said, this is wrong behavior, and stood up at another time and engaged in that very same behavior. This is really unacceptable, and I think that this government should be ashamed to bring forward this Financial Statutes Amendment Act, Bill 10, at this time with this kind of behavior engaged and embedded in it. I would have loved to have seen an act that did more to correct the very many mistakes of this government, that resolved the problems this government created with affordability, for example. The fact that they took the cap off of electricity rates and people started paying huge amounts more, some in the neighborhood of 300% more than they used to pay, because they took the cap off. Because they took the cap off of insurance. People's insurance rates went up to 20, 30, 40%. And even after they somehow decided that a cap was okay, after saying it wasn't okay, they brought in a cap, and then they allowed a number of companies to increase their rates right away as the cap was coming in. We saw some companies increase their rates by 15%. So, I mean, they didn't even protect people when they were bringing in the cap which they originally opposed. This government has made a lot of errors in the time that they've been in government, and I'm always happy when they fix those errors. I'm just, really surprised that they are here with this huge amount of bonus money that came from the sheer chance of the price of oil going up dramatically from where it is now, and they're not using that money in a way to make life better for Albertans. I think they could have done that. They chose not to do that. And here we are now talking about a bill where they have found money for themselves, for their own self-interest, but not money for the people that have been suffering with high rates of the cost of food, the cost of insurance, the cost of tuition, and how difficult it's been for so many people who live on very limited incomes, seniors who have had money taken away from them for drug coverage, students in schools who have had money taken away from them for their educational assistance. Just the list of people who've had to suffer under this government, rhetoric.
Order, order, order. Unparliamentary comments, on or off the record, are unparliamentary. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have a little leniency for this particular member because it is his last week being an MLA in this House. And I guess it's his last chance to take shots, knowing that he won't be standing here after May 29th. I think I've made it very clear what I think about this act, and I certainly wish the government would take the opportunity to fix the problems that they've created in a way that was direct and honest in terms of the needs of the Albertans and not in the needs of their own political party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there others? The honourable member for Calgary Glenmore has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm reasonably certain I'm not the only person in this chamber who remembers a certain bumper sticker from years ago. It said something along the lines of, "Please God, let there be another boom, and I promise not to."
This one.
Shh, ... So, why would somebody put that bumper sticker up? It's because our natural resource revenues are worth something. They're worth something not only to every individual in Alberta, every Albertan who is living now of all ages, but they're worth something for those who are yet to be born. The resources that are within the ground in the province of Alberta belong not just to us as Albertans today, they belong to future generations of Albertans as well. Mm-hmm. And at some point, this province, because it's a non-renewable resource, oil and gas, will at some point see those royalties eventually vanish. So we ought to be treating these royalty revenues with respect, with the respect that is due for those future generations and for the younger people in our province today. So I'm a bit disappointed, I'll say, and I use that word, I'm just using a nice word. I'm very disappointed to hear that the opposition talking about slush funds. Clearly they've been given their word of the day by their caucus bosses, and they're out there with their anger words for the day, whipping it up so that tomorrow on Twitter they can, have another good Twitter day. Good for them. This is a pretty serious matter, though. It's not to be taken lightly whatsoever. So what is this fund called the Alberta Fund? What is that? Well, it's not a slush fund. It is the fund that represents fiscal responsibility and using funds properly when you have a surplus. I'm sorry, but I door knock a lot. I talk to constituents every day. I talk to them on the phone, I talk to them at meetings, I talk to them on their doorstep. And they all tell me that they want our debt repaid. Yep. They all tell me they don't want to spend debt financing charges instead of putting that money towards services. They all tell me that our Heritage Savings Trust Fund deserves to have funds put in it, not just taken out of it. Yep. They tell me that every day. They're very happy that a fiscal framework has been put into place, and they're very happy that there's some fiscal discipline. Because guess what? That money belongs to Albertans. Yep. It is not there to just spend willy-nilly on pet projects. And so it's outlined. And I don't know, maybe instead of just rambling on about this, that, and the other thing that has little relevance to the conversation tonight on this bill, Bill 10, perhaps they could take a look at page 14 and onwards, where we talk about the fiscal framework. Fiscal framework not only talks about surplus funds, but it also talks about balanced budgets. There's a concept for the members opposite. But let's talk about slush funds for a minute here. Does anybody remember the carbon tax? Oh, okay. I remember the carbon tax, and I remember what it was supposed to be spent on. It was supposed to be spent to reduce emissions. What happened with that? Well, they used it as a money recycling program. That's number one. Number two, they had some programs where we had good people coming from Ontario driving around in wrapped vans replacing light bulbs and shower heads. Light bulbs and shower heads that any of us could buy at Home Depot, by the way. Yeah, that's how they spent it. But you know where the slush fund ended up? The end of their term, they had $500 million almost dollars laying around that they couldn't even figure out how to spend. They were really good at taking it out of people's pockets. Not just families, but every community center, every hospital, every school, every not-for-profit agency, every women's shelter, every single place that they could find a carbon tax to take, they took it. And then they couldn't figure out how to, there was a slush fund right there. The good thing that we had good folks from Ontario coming and changing light bulbs for us. So let's go back to the fiscal framework. The first thing to recognize is how you get a balanced budget and what are the guidelines for that. So, the budget will not be permitted to be in deficit if revenue declines by $1 billion or more from the prior year third quarter revenue forecast. These are the exceptions that we get. Your revenue has to decline by more than $1 billion. Revenue is expected to decline to an amount that is below the prior year Q3 total expense forecast. At year end, a deficit is only allowed if the consolidated financial statements, if a deficit is forecast in the budget as permitted by the exceptions, actual revenue has declined by $500 million or more from the current year budget amount, or the budget voted contingency is exceeded due to unanticipated costs beyond the government's control due to disasters or emergencies declared by Cabinet, expense increases required by the Alberta Petrochemicals Incentive Program, APIP, non-cash, non-recurring expense increases required under the accounting standards, and or expense increases by $500 million or more for payments related to litigation or settlements not anticipated by the budget. Okay, so there's your exceptions. And one of those exceptions is actually for APIP. And what does APIP do? It's an incentive program that brings businesses and large projects into this province that will generate revenue for years to come based on what? Feedstock of? That's right, nat gas. So, yep, we can put a big project in after a budget is done. In-year expense growth. It's to limit in-year adjusted operating expense increases to the budget and voted contingency except when increases are due to dedicated revenue expense increases. So these are expenses that are actually incurred to raise revenue. Non-recurring, non-cash expense variations required by accounting standards, emergencies or disasters declared by Cabinet, expenses under the APIP program, payments related to litigation. Okay. So if we end up with a surplus, then what? This is what these folks across the aisle are referring to as a slush fund. Let's see, what's that for? What's this slush fund for? 50% of the available surplus cash must go to the repayment of debt maturing in that fiscal year, with the remaining cash allocated to the new Alberta Fund. The Alberta Fund allows the government to set aside surplus cash while it decides the best use of this cash. There are 3 allowable uses of cash from the Alberta Fund. Does that sound like a slush fund to you? Debt repayment, that's 1.
Here.
Additional deposits into the Heritage Fund, that's 2. Number 3, one-time initiatives that do not lead to permanent increases in government spending. Well, that sure sounds like a slush fund, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Wow. And our in-year expenses. What are the guidelines for that? 4 components. So we require annual balanced budget with certain exceptions. We've gone over the exceptions. We limit year-over-year increases in operating expense to population growth and inflation. Yes, folks, that's called fiscal discipline. and it's long overdue in this province, and people have been begging for it. Limit in-year expense growth to a budgeted and voted contingency, and set out policies for the allocation of surplus cash to repayment of maturing debt, saving for the future, or one-time initiatives that do not lead to permanent increases in government spending. That's the fiscal framework. That is not a slush fund. That is responsible fiscal management of the people of Alberta's money, respecting the resources that belong to the people of Alberta and future generations of Albertans. And I'm sorry that the debate tonight has just been disrespectful of those who are yet to be born and those who are young. Those resources belong to all Albertans. The revenue from those resources belong to all Albertans, and it is required that we manage those responsibly, with discipline. And Albertans want that. They tell me over and over again. So the side across can keep talking about their word of the day for their Twitter fodder, but I think Albertans deserve better than that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there others? Honourable members, seeing none, I am prepared to call the question. Honourable members, for second reading of Bill 10, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2022. All those in favour of the motion for second reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 10, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2023 is now read a second time. Committee of the Whole.
Sorry, that was just like, you're going to get it there. That was just like muscle memory. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to go to the thing? I was so ready to go with it. I was like, oh. It's right here. Yeah. We're allowed to have fun.
I would like to call the committee to order. The Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill number 8, the Alberta Firearms Act. Are there any comments, questions, or amendments to be offered with respect to this bill? Seeing none, I'm prepared to call the question. On the question on Bill 8, the Alberta Firearms Act, are you agreed? Agreed. Opposed? Carried. On the title preamble, are you agreed? Agreed. Opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Agreed. Opposed? Carried.
Whip. I would like to rise and report progress on Bill 8.
Sorry, are you asking that we rise and report on Bill 8?
Yes. Yes.
Right, thank you. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please say no. Carried.
We need at least one speaker to get our stuff together. West, yell ahead. We're supposed to have a speaker. It's okay though, it's okay. Good job. Hey, look, good.
The Honourable Member for West Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bills. Bill 8.
Does the Assembly concur on the report? All those opposed? Carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for Second Reading, Bill 11, Appropriation Act 2023, adjourned debate. Honourable Mr. Taves.
Anyone wishing to add to debate tonight? Seeing none, I'm prepared to call the question. The Appropriation Act 2023. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. I believe the ayes have it. Carried.
Bill 11, Appropriation Act 2023 is now read a second time. Under Government Bills and Orders for Second Reading, Bill 12, Appropriation Supplementary Supply Act 2023, adjourned debate. Honourable Mr. Taves.
Honourable members wishing to speak to Bill 12, the Appropriation Supplementary Supply Bill 2023. Seeing none, I'm prepared to ask the question. All those in favour of second reading for Bill 12, the Appropriation Supplementary Supply Bill 2023, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The ayes have it. Carried.
Bill 12, Appropriation Supplementary Supply Act 2023 is now read a second time.
The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seems like a lot of great work has been done tonight in a very short period of time. I thank all members for their participation, and at this time I move that the Assembly be adjourned until tomorrow, until tomorrow, March 22nd. Until tomorrow, 1:30 p.m. We'll leave the date.
Having heard the motion by the Honourable Government House Leader, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. The ayes have it. The Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow afternoon, not June, at 1:30 p.m.
Richard. You guys are money to the